we can get going. So this is our final individual speaker of the day. We're going to go until about 4:20, at which point there's more coffee downstairs for those who need their final hit of caffeine. We'll then come back and have a panel discussion, and then for those who are interested, we'll probably go for a drink somewhere. I'm thinking the terrace because it's sunny out here in London, and that never happens, so we should rejoice. Okay, so let's hand over to Professor Stephen Luper, who's joining us from San Antonio, Texas, kindly online, and kindly has been very flexible, and despite us giving him the wrong time, has joined early anyway. So thank you, Stephen, and we'll hand over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. And I also want to thank Dr. Devanesan for inviting me to be part of this workshop. It's a great topic. I'll start by describing what I want to do today. Most of us take for granted more than one view about what we are, and we don't fully realize how greatly at odds the ideas are. We struggle to sort them out, I think, and to choose among them. As a consequence, I suggest we also find it difficult to reach a definitive conclusion about what it is for us to die. In these remarks, I'm going to illustrate our predicament by sketching two main views of ourselves. They're not exhaustive, just illustrative. The first is that we're organisms. We're the human animals that Carl Linnaeus dubbed Homo sapiens. The second is that we're thinkers. We're thinking objects that are distinct from human animals. I suspect that in some contexts we see ourselves one way, and in other contexts we see ourselves the other way. People are probably seeing themselves as animals when they say things like, I was about 2 years old when I developed the ability to think about myself. They probably see themselves as thinkers when they say things like, ending my ability to think will end my existence. Yet these views suggest very different things about death. The animal view implies that our deaths are those of the animals to which we're identical. By contrast, what the thinker view supports is that we and our animals are distinct mortal objects, and the dying process for the one need not coincide with nor resemble the dying process for the other. Okay, so that's the agenda. I'll begin by laying out some assumptions about the death of an animal. I'll assume, at least initially, that for organisms in general, and human animals in particular, death consists in ceasing to be alive. I'll call this the loss of life account of death. Given the loss of life account, if we wanted to fully understand the death of an organism, we'd need to clarify what it is to be alive. I won't resolve this complex issue, but I do want to sketch a very rough account of life that I'll draw upon in what follows. I'll start with some assumptions about the composition of material objects, some of which are alive, such as armadillos, and some that never are, such as tables and boulders. Molecules or assemblies of molecules come to compose material objects roughly by being bonded together. Over time, material objects may change in composition incrementally, but while objects that are not alive can't control what their constituents are, nor how they're arrayed, objects that are alive normally can. They can add and subtract from the things of which they're composed, and they can arrange these into various structures, such as cells. This is made possible by the activities of their constituents, and these activities are integrated in conformity with information carried by their nucleic acid molecules. Let's call these vital activities. Examples include photosynthesis, chemosynthesis, respiration, cell construction, and so forth. Bringing these points together, the suggestion is that to be alive is roughly to be composed of molecules that working together have the capacity to engage in vital activities, activities integrated in conformity with instructions and information carried by the nucleic acid molecules among them. If we combine this rough account of life with the loss of life account of death, we can characterize what death is for organisms. Death consists in their ceasing to be alive, which itself consists in losing the capacity to engage in integrated vital activities. Of course, ceasing to be alive is one thing, and having ceased to be alive is another. The term death can refer to either, but we can reserve the term dead to indicate that an organism is no longer alive, and we can say that dying is the or a sequence of events or process by which an organism loses the capacity to engage in integrated vital activities. It's reasonable to speak of dying as a process because vital capacities may be lost gradually rather than all at once. The dying process might be initiated, say by a heart attack, then reversed, say by restoring heartbeat with electroshock. In some cases, the process is especially complicated because the vital activities of some organisms, such as human animals, result in the construction of complex physiological systems that must remain largely intact for the vital activities of those organisms to remain integrated. Some theorists who define death focus on these systems and claim that a human animal's life ends when that organism's physiological systems can no longer function as an integrated whole. Okay, I've now sketched a view about the nature of death for organisms. If we're animals, as a group of theorists called animalists say, then each of us will have an animal's death. However, most theorists reject animalism. What I'll do next is discuss some of the competing views of what we are. I'll start with the animalist approach and say a bit more about it, and then I'm going to turn to two more popular accounts, both versions of the view that we are thinkers. Animalism, as I'll understand it, makes three claims. The first is roughly that all of us are human animals, but that claim needs clarification. Animalists take it for granted that there exist some objects, each of which has the property of being a human animal. Animalists say that I am one of these objects, and so are you, and so is each of us. That is, each of us is numerically identical to one of these objects. One of them and I are one and the same, and something similar is true of everyone else. I want to lay out a second claim that animalists make, but first I'm going to need to clarify a term I'll draw on, namely the term persistence conditions. Objects are said to persist when they exist over time from one moment to another. I parked my car in my garage yesterday, and it's still there. It persisted through the night. The persistence conditions of an object that exists at some time are defined as the conditions that are necessary and sufficient for that object to exist at some other time. Okay, so here's the second of the animalist's claims. It says that because you and I are identical to objects that have the property human animal, we have the persistence conditions of those objects. The third animalist claim is that each of the objects that has the property of being a human animal is a human animal essentially. The property human animal is essential to the objects that bear it. Of course, some objects, such as ducks and bricks, don't have the property of being a human animal at all, much less as an essential features. And some properties that objects happen to have are not essential to them. Take the property of being a teacher, for example. I happen to have this property, but I've not always had it, and I expect to remain in existence after I stop having it. When an object has the property of being a teacher, it has that property only contingently. Properties that are contingent to an object if it could exist without them. They're essential to it if it could not exist without them. Animal essentialism says human animals are essentially human animals. We might call these objects for which human animality is an essential attribute, essential animals. From these three claims, it follows that you and I are essentially human animals. So if we persist at all, we persist as animals. So much for the view that we're animals. Next, I'll describe two versions of the view that we're thinkers. One version I'll call personism. The other I'll call mindism. Personism, as I'll understand it, makes three claims. First, each of us is identical to one of the objects that have the property of being a person. To be a person at a time is roughly to be capable of self-awareness at that time. The second claim that they make is that you and I have the persistence conditions of these objects to which we're identical. The third claim is person essentialism, which says that the property of being a person is an essential feature of every object that has that property. We might call these objects for which personhood is an essential attribute, essential persons. Personists further clarify their view by saying that a person's persistence from an earlier to a later time requires that the psychological attributes she has at the earlier time exhibit a certain sort of continuity with the psychological attributes some object has at the later time. The chief proponent of personism, Derek Parfit, puts the point this way: the continued existence of persons essentially involves psychological continuity. I'm going to discuss psychological continuity further in a little while. Okay, on to the second version of the thinker view, which is mindism. Mindism says that each of us is one of the objects that is a mind, that an object is a mind at a time if and only if it is capable of consciousness at that time, that we have the persistence conditions of these objects, and that all objects that are minds are essentially minds. They are, we might say, essential minds. It'd be nice at this point to clarify the nature of consciousness, but it's notoriously difficult to do that. It might help to cite Thomas Nagel's view that an individual, say a bat, is in a state of consciousness if and only if there's something it's like for it to be in that state. But for our purposes, the key point is that consciousness need not involve self-awareness. Some creatures, say Nagel's bat or my dog, are capable of consciousness, but not self-awareness. So mindism implies that we are the same sort of object as bats and dogs and other sentient things. Incidentally, mindism should be distinguished from a view that we might call brainism, which says that we're the brains currently located within human animals. Before moving on, let me make a few comments now about the views that I've just discussed, a couple of comments about how they're interrelated. One point is that while not all do, most theorists combine thinker essentialism with a materialist metaphysics, saying that thinkers are realized in the human animals whose matter they share, much as a statue is distinct from, but realized in the bronze of which it is composed. Another point is that each of the views that I've mentioned is inconsistent with the others, since our persistence conditions on the one view differ from our persistence conditions on the others. However, animal essentialism is consistent with the others. Perhaps some objects, the persons, are essentially persons, and others, the human animals, are essentially animals. It's conceivable that both sorts of objects exist. That said, it's unlikely that an animal essentialist will accept either form of thinker essentialism. This is because animalists will maintain that animals can become, they can develop into thinkers, at which time they will be thinkers. And that's possible only if an animal may acquire consciousness and personhood as contingent features. And that's a possibility that the thinker essentialist rules out. Let's add that thinker essentialists may well accept animal essentialism, but in doing so, they must deny that animals are ever conscious or self-aware. They must deny that animals can think. If animals can think at all, they do so contingently. And that's ruled out by thinker essentialism. This concludes my sketch of views about what we are. Next, I'll mention worries that some of them face and how others address those worries. I'll start with the main criticism its critics press against animalism. The chief worry about animalism is its counterintuitive implications for certain hypothetical cases, primarily one that involves brain transplantation. So suppose two individuals have suffered terrible injuries. Ethel's brain has been destroyed, leaving the rest of her body intact, while all of Fred's body has been destroyed except for his brain, which is unharmed. Next, suppose that this brain is successfully transplanted into the brainless body. If asked, most people will say that Ethel does not survive, but Fred does, fitted out with a new body. Yet the animalist view suggests something very different. In the first place, it suggests that Fred does not survive. According to animalism, before Fred's body was destroyed, he was a human animal, but no human animal is moved to a new head. A bare brain is no more an animal than is a liver or a spleen. So if we try to pare Fred the animal down to his brain, bit by bit, at some point in the process, well before we get down to his brain, he stops existing. Moving his brain does not move Fred anywhere. And here's something else suggested by animalism. Ethel does survive the procedure, or at least she does on the assumption that a human animal can be kept alive on life support after the loss of its brain, an assumption that's supported by the fact that some brain-dead individuals have given birth to children after many days on life support. Given this assumption, Ethel's received an organ transplant. Her newly acquired brain does the thinking for her. I can't resist digressing briefly to mention that a head transplant procedure may be performed eventually, which shows just how seductive the view is that we would go with our brains if they, inside our heads, were successfully grafted onto headless bodies. A surgeon named Sergio Canavero proposed doing this procedure back in 2015, and even had a brain donor lined up, but he ran into skepticism about its feasibility. In a 2022 article, he's proposed transplanting brains instead of whole heads. Despite the opposition, there seems to be a good chance that eventually he'll be allowed to perform his procedure. Of course, I can't say whether that's going to happen or not in the near future, but he seems to regard it as the ultimate body makeover. Of course, theorists who believe we go with our brains can deal with the transplantation case by accepting the brainist view that we are our brains, or they can accept one of the thinker views. Of these, the most widely accepted seems to be personism. But as I'm going to show next, proponents of mindism can put up a pretty good case against personism. I'll be focusing on Parfit's version of personism, so let me begin by clarifying his view a bit further. Earlier, I mentioned Parfit's stipulation that persons, or Lockean persons as he calls them, remain in existence from one time to another only if their psychological attributes display a certain sort of continuity over that time. When clarifying this stipulation, Parfit distinguishes between continuity and something he calls connectedness. He says that the requisite continuity consists in overlapping chains of strong connectedness. As for connectedness, his view is that an individual existing at one time is psychologically connected to an individual existing at a later time, when direct psychological relations hold between them. For example, connectedness occurs when the individual at the earlier time has an experience and the individual at the later time can remember having it. Parfit adds that strong connectedness exists, just if over each day there are at least half the number of direct connections that hold over every day in the lives of nearly every actual person. So as Lockean persons will stop existing if the degree of our psychological connectedness drops below a certain threshold. It seems likely that severe dementia could make that happen. Dementia is a disorder in which a person's cognitive abilities are compromised. In damaging cognitive abilities, dementia gradually destroys the capacity for awareness. In degrading awareness, dementia gradually destroys self-awareness. Eventually, dementia can give way to a persistent vegetative state. The term vegetative state refers to the condition of individuals who are incapable of voluntary interaction with the environment, but who retain, in some degree, a sleep-waking cycle and respiration or digestive functioning. Now, personism implies that dementia can end the existence of a Lockean person well before the onset of persistent vegetation. This is because severe dementia will eventually disrupt the psychological continuity that's required for the continued existence of a Lockean person, which can happen even if the victim retains a minimal level of self-awareness. This result may seem tolerable at first, but as mindists will point out, the consequences of Parfit's view are exceedingly strange. To see why, consider a Lockean person I'll call Betty. Suppose Betty develops dementia, which over time drastically diminishes her cognitive abilities, ending the strong continuity of her mental life. At that point, according to Parfit, Betty stops existing. However, she may leave behind an object that still has a mental life. In fact, that object might retain the capacity for self-awareness, in which case it certainly seems as if somebody remains after Betty's existence ends. Call her Sue. It's tempting to say that Sue is a person, perhaps a minimal person, but it's tempting to say that she's a person since she's capable of a fair degree of self-awareness and can track her own continued existence to some extent. But she's not a Lockean person since she's incapable of the strong psychological connectedness that Parfit requires. Sue is nobody and unable to persist, or at least she's not a persisting Lockean person. And so, according to Parfit, she's not a person in the sense that you and I are persons. That's pretty counterintuitive. We can call that the problem of minimal persons. To solve this problem, we could reject Parfit's assumption that persons persist only if their mental life displays continuity involving strong connectedness. We might instead allow that weak psychological continuity suffices. But mindists step in with a different fix. Namely, that Betty never was one of the objects Parfit describes, the Lockean persons that can only persist by way of strong psychological continuity. In fact, mindists will want to deny that essential persons exist at all. This is because Betty is a mind that came to have the capacity for self-awareness after existing for some time. But she could acquire this capacity only if, for minds such as Betty, self-awareness is a contingent property, which is a possibility that person essentialism rules out. Mindists will add that although Betty suffered dementia that substantially reduced the quality of her psychological continuity, she remains one and the same mind. They may also say that she'll continue to do so unless and until she loses the capacity for consciousness. Okay, that's enough about the face-off among the different views of what we are. Next, I want to discuss the trouble that the rivalry among them causes those who want to settle on an account of death. I'll begin with some points about what animalism implies about death. The first point is simply a reminder that given the animalist view, a death for you and me is an animal death. A second point concerns what happens when animals live through the loss of some feature that's contingent to them, such as the property of being a teacher or a child. Such a loss does not in itself constitute a death. Obviously, the animals don't die thereby, but it's also false that a child or a teacher dies in the course of such a transition. We must be cautious in speaking of a child persisting or ceasing to persist. What persists or not, what has persistence conditions, is the human animal that's passing through childhood. To say that a child persists over some interval of time is to say that a human animal persists over that time and retains the property of being a child over that interval. A third point follows from the second. Together with the animalist's claim that for human animals, consciousness and self-awareness are contingent properties. What follows is that when an animal lives through the loss of the property of consciousness or self-awareness or personhood, that loss is not a death. The story is quite different on the thinker views, which say we're essential thinkers. When we speak of an essential thinker, we're not talking, as an animalist would, about an animal going through a phase during which it can think. If we're essential thinkers, then we're not animals, even though we share their matter. What's more, the ending of our existence need not coincide with the deaths of the human animals in which we're realized. In a brain transplantation case, like the one discussed earlier, we essential thinkers go with our brains and our existence continues, but our animals die. And in cases of persistent vegetation, damage that ends our existence leaves behind our animal still alive. I just said that we essential thinkers may stop existing before our animals do. Does it follow that we can die before they do? Well, it would, on the assumption that an essential thinker dies when it's terminated, when it stops existing. But that assumption needs defense. Or does it? Can we even make sense of the idea of an essential thinker escaping death when it stops existing? Well, objects that are never alive, such as bubbles and vases, can't die. So they don't die when they terminate, when they stop existing. And there could be sophisticated non-living mechanisms that achieve self-awareness and hence are persons. If you're familiar with Data from the TV series Star Trek, that would be the sort of mechanism I'm imagining. I guess if we're essential thinkers, then Data would be too. In his case, he'd be a thinker, a person realized in a machine. Such mechanical essential thinkers are never alive, so it makes sense to say they never die. However, even if they grant that there could be such persons, I don't expect personists will be drawn to the idea that you and I are never alive. They're going to say that we're alive by virtue of the fact that, unlike the Data type persons, we're realized in living animals or in a detached part of one, a brain that's being kept on life support. Still, there may be another way to make sense of the deathless termination of an essential thinker. Perhaps we could borrow the reasoning by which some notable theorists have argued that various living organisms cease to exist without dying. Here's what I have in mind. According to J. Rosenberg, a deathless termination occurs when an amoeba reproduces, when they divide in reproduction. Dividing into two amoebas ends its existence, but dividing isn't dying. Fred Feldman agrees, and he offers some other examples of living things seemingly exiting deathlessly. He thinks it happens when pairs of certain single-celled algae fuse to produce a zygote. Why do they deny that death, they meaning Jay Rosenberg and Fred Feldman, why do they deny that death occurs in these cases of termination? I imagine it's because the events by which the amoebas or the algae stop existing don't resemble ordinary death. Dividing doesn't resemble ordinary death, for example. In ordinary death, the machinery by which vital capacities are exercised is destroyed. Hearts stop pumping, the circulatory system breaks down, and its various components, such as red blood cells, are destroyed. Such destruction doesn't occur when an amoeba divides. In division, the bits of an organism that are performing its vital functions, its vital activities, are transferred, as it were, to other organisms, taking the original organisms out of existence. Just as we might doubt that the terminations of dividing amoebas constitute deaths, so we might doubt that the terminations of essential thinkers are deaths. The termination may involve very little loss of the machinery by which organisms engage in vital activities. Instead, the termination may result from damage to the cerebrum. And I already discussed the way that dementia can end a person's existence with even less damage by dragging the strength of psychological continuity below Parfit's threshold, while leaving behind a minimal person, hence a mind. And here's another way to terminate a person with very little physical damage. In one of his essays, Bernard Williams imagined a process by which information encoding memories and the like is extracted from one person's brain and used to replace the information in another's brain. He imagined that through this mechanism, the personality, the psychological features of one person could be abruptly transferred to another, like replacing the information on a computer file with that on another file. If something like that were feasible, it would be possible to end a person's psychological continuity, hence her existence, without damaging her brain cells, and hence without causing anything like the death of her animal. So there's a case for saying essential thinkers may stop existing deathlessly. Fortunately, however, there's a stronger case, at least to my mind, for denying that any living object may terminate deathlessly. Here's the argument I have in mind. It's on that handout you've got. Notice that nothing can remain alive if it ceases to exist. Hence, it ceases to be alive if it ceases to exist. But dying just is ceasing to be alive according to the loss of life account. Hence, all living objects die upon terminating. Whether I'm an essential thinker or not, whether I'm an essential thinker or some other sort of living object, if I stop existing, I stop being alive and thereby die. All right, here's a brief recap. I've discussed three sorts of objects that we might be: human, animals, persons, and minds. As I hinted at the outset, I think that people tend to believe that all three exist, but rarely carefully distinguish the one from the others and find it difficult to sort out which they're identical to. Yet animalism, personism, and mindism imply very different things about death and dying processes. If we're animals, then like other organisms, we cease to be alive when the vital capacities by which we maintain ourselves are lost. Typically, this loss involves deterioration, but there appear to be exceptions as when amoebas divide themselves. We might say that in the exceptional cases, organisms die by ceasing to exist, by termination, and that for them, the dying process is the set of events that brings this about. If now we accept personism, we'll want to say that we essential persons too can die by termination, and that the dying process involved need not resemble the process by which human animals ordinarily die. We can make similar claims about mindism if we accept mindism. But since mind essentialists are likely to deny the existence of essential persons, they'll probably say that in itself, ceasing to be a person is not a dying process. As for animal essentialists, they're likely to deny the existence of both sorts of essential thinkers and say that in itself, ceasing to be a thinker of either sort is not a dying process. That's my presentation. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to give 5 to 10 minutes for questions. My voice is gone. Elseline's got a question here.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephen. It's Elseline Kingma. I'm professor of philosophy here at King's College London. So forgive me because this question is perhaps not the most pertinent one to the clinical case, but I wanted to press you more about the amoeba case and the possibility of things exiting deathlessly. So, you say, well, perhaps they're not like ordinary death. But of course, that posits as ordinary the case of us highly unusual, like brained, multicellular animals. So, cast your mind back, a couple of million years, and all we have is a society of amoebae and other monocellular life. And, suppose the amoebae think they have a workshop on death and dying. They're not going to think. It's going to be clear to them that there are two ways for them, amoebae, to end their lives. One is to, let's call it die, to wither, to be wounded, to be eaten, something like that. And one of them is to cease existing by reproducing, right? By granting life to the next generation. And indeed, the previous speaker spoke about Heidegger. Had there been a Heidegger amongst them who'd been like, we amoebae must live towards death, be like, no, we amoebae live towards reproduction, right? That's what our life is geared towards, cessation in the act of giving or whatever. So that, in a way, is the central case of life, right, of the living world. There is to end in the act of reproduction or to end not in the act of reproduction. And the kind of death that we posit as ordinary is one that is a consequence of multicellular organization, germ-soma separation, such that we have these complex cellular bodies that eventually give out, often after we have reproduced at an earlier stage, having, hopefully not, for most of us, not died in the act, or some of us, So once you've got that on the table, it seems for the amoebae like really plausible to think that there are two ways of exiting, right? To exit by death or to cease to exist, in their case, in reproduction. And once that is on the table, why should we accept your premise that dying just is ceasing to be alive, as opposed to thinking that cessation of living is maybe necessary for death. No, the other way around. Cessation of living may be sufficient for death, but it's not. No, I'm getting it wrong. Anyway, you get my brain is running out. Sufficient but not necessary, right? And there is indeed ending deathlessly. Then, of course, there's a further question whether essential persons could do. I mean, they clearly can't do what amoebae do, which is to end in the act of reproduction. But maybe there's some other way, nonetheless, for them to exit deathlessly. At least that concept is back on the table, it seems to me. That was the end of the
Yes.
question. Sorry.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think in an argument with the people that I cited, Feldman, Rosenberg, I doubt we could come to agreement because I'm hunkering down in this original definition of death that I gave, cessation of life. And I'm saying that it applies to both of the cases, the case where, for example, the amoeba gets stepped on, versus the case where the amoeba reproduces and divides. In both, they cease to be alive. And I'm thinking that suffices for there to be a univocal concept of death. But it is certainly the case that the process by which the cessation of life occurs, the processes here are quite different. The squishing process versus the dividing in two process. I drew upon the notion of an ordinary death to try to explain why people like Feldman and Rosenberg would hesitate to say that the reproductive case is a case of death. And I agree that also quite cases also which are not ordinary would be the case where, say, a person's psychological continuity drops below a certain threshold. That's also a case where it really doesn't look anything like the ordinary kind of case of death. But again, I mean, if you do accept person essentialism, when that happens, you do stop existing. And anything that stops existing does cease to be alive. That's the best I can do.
There's a quick follow-up from Arjun.
Thanks, Stephen. I presume that in the amoeba case, the reason why the parent amoeba ceases to exist, why the parent amoeba dies is because it ceases to exist, as opposed to there being any actual occurrence of vital functions ceasing to persist, right? So you say to be alive is roughly to be composed of molecules that working together can engage in vital activities. In the case of cell division of amoebas, it's not at all obvious that at any point does anything cease to be alive if being alive is only to be composed of molecules that working together engage in vital activities. So potentially the issue is there, that your definition of alive does not tell us that that there's a cessation of being alive occurring in reproduction. And the only reason why we intuitively think that the parent amoeba is no longer alive is because we think it no longer exists, because it's no longer composed, because we think that the daughter cells are non-identical to the parent, for example. So it's not the alive condition is doing no work in grounding a death here.
A couple of points. One is actually in the case of the amoeba, if you apply the account of death that I offer, you could easily say that it's a fitting case to the amoeba case. What I mean is, the way I define being alive is, you've got an object which is holding itself together through a certain set of activities that are integrated. And when the amoeba comes apart, those processes are no longer integrated. So there, at least in the case of the amoeba, it's a pretty clear implication of the criterion of death, that death would occur. But it's also the case that, I mean, I don't want to try to evade the point that you and the previous questioner raised, and that is something very different is happening in a lot of these cases. When an object stops existing, and by virtue of that, the object ceases to be alive. I agree that it's substantially different. But the question arises is, don't we still want to call that a kind of death? I mean, if you're a person essentialist, are you going to want to say that the individuals who stop existing aren't dead?
Okay, we suddenly have lots of hands, and I need to make an executive decision because we were meant to finish 5 minutes ago. So is this quick? We're going to make it quick. One more.
Okay.
Thanks. Sorry. Thanks, Stephen. It's really interesting. I want to move away from the amoebas a little bit to people and pick up with the person you mentioned with dementia and this concept of minimal persons, and something with that just really, I guess, jarred the idea of them cease to exist. I wondered whether, for me, came in that all of these accounts are very individualistic, and actually how I see people as living is very relational. And I wondered whether do you think some of the sort of issue with the minimal person dying through person be reconciled by that continuity coming from others providing that remembering of who you were and remembering and bringing you back together through time, or facilitating that through an environment? So actually a more relational account of who we are as individuals that moves beyond just the single organism in that way.
I would struggle to make that work. I'd have to work out cases where it looks like there's a pretty clear case of death, but people are still holding the memory of that individual. I mean, if on the proposed account, the fact that others continue vividly to remember the individual, if the assumption is that means the individual's not dead, I guess I would just say that's a kind of a metaphorical use of the term dead. Yeah, I guess someone mentioned Heidegger. I'm gonna want to come back to the idea that death is an individual event. It's something that can happen if there's only one individual in existence. The last individual there is, well, it's got nothing to do with the ones that are around them, whether they die or not. Go ahead. I see another hand.
So there are more hands, but I might suggest that we take a scheduled break 10 minutes late, but we'll be coming back for a big panel and group discussion. Is that right, Audrey? So I think what we should do is have a 20-minute break. Everyone can get caffeinated. At least I need some caffeine. And then we'll come back in 20 minutes and we can start the panel discussion and pick up on some of these topics. Is that okay? Good. Okay. So thank you, Steve, for your talk.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And-
Send me